I'd like to ask, a lot of people have been saying that lower oil prices were going to have more impact on Russia than sanctions. Do you agree?
Yes, I think I broadly agree with that. There's no question that sanctions are having an impact, particularly right now in terms of financial access. Companies are finding it difficult, if not impossible, to access new financing, particularly from Western sources, and that is the kind of more immediate problem that the big Russian companies are having to deal with. They're either having to turn to the state, looking for some bailouts, and we've obviously heard some very large numbers from some companies such as Rosneft, or they're maybe looking for alternative sources, perhaps from non-sanctioned companies in Asia. So that's the more immediate problem, and of course falling oil prices, which means falling cash flows, just exacerbates that situation. Longer term, the situation in the energy sector is more about accessing technology. It's kind of more a balance between how quickly Russia will be able to replicate or substitute some of the technologies that are now blocked from the West. And of course, whether a big part of that will be the cash flows available from the oil price. If there's lots of money, then they will be able to replicate that more quickly than if the oil price is low and they're struggling with financing as well as cash flows.
Thank you. What will it take to restore investor confidence in Russia?
Well, I think we've had a number of crises over the years. Obviously, in the energy sector, in terms of investor confidence, the UCAS case was quite notable. I think two things. One, simply people do get used to new situations in Russia, and so long as the deterioration doesn't keep going, then we have in the past been surprised how quickly foreign investors do get used to assessment of new risk and kind of get on with it, as it were. So very key to this will be that sanctions do not get any worse. Now, of course, if the best case scenario is that there's a political resolution in terms of Russia-Ukraine and sanctions start to ease early next year, and of course that will be met with a great sigh of relief by everybody. But I think even if sanctions remain as they are, people do get used to the current situation. They're better able to assess the risk, and kind of business does start to improve. So I really don't see any kind of third magic wand solution where Russia suddenly becomes a much better place with new positions. I think it's either a case that sanctions start to ease slowly or stay as they are. The worst case, of course, is to continue to deteriorate, and we all can imagine the consequences of that.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems at the moment that we are at risk of heading into a stalemate here on sanctions on both sides. What do you think is going to be the next stage?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the more likely situation is a political stalemate, at least, because Russia has made very clear that it has two key priorities in relation to Ukraine. One is Crimea is clearly not going back. It's now an integral part of the Russian Federation as far as the Moscow government is concerned, and then that will be an ongoing, I think, contentious issue with the West. And also the Kremlin has made clear that it views some sort of a buffer zone in East Ukraine as also critical for its national interests. So again, another issue that's not going to be resolved easily and will be a source of confrontation. So I think a stalemate in terms of politics is more likely to be the norm rather than a return to what we had before. Now, in terms of business, that means that likely sanctions will remain in place for longer. No immediate easing, but there's no reason to suspect or to expect that they'll worsen either. And what that generally means is that I think we will see some decline in Russian oil production in 2015-16. We definitely see some slowdown in investment in, say, brownfield, in some other areas. The priority will try and keep key projects growing. But, we're 10.5 million barrels average this year, probably dropped down by 200,000 or 300,000 barrels, but I don't see anything more dramatic. It is a key policy requirement of the Kremlin that Russia maintain average daily oil production at around 10 million barrels a day or higher. So I think that if there was a real danger that 10 million limit was to be breached for any period of time, then I think we would see the oil sector getting considerably more faster resources from the state in order to address that. So some decline is inevitable, but I really don't see it developing into anything dramatic.
Thanks. It seems to me that this uncertainty that's created by the sanctions is kind of breeding instability in the oil and gas sector in Russia, and there's sort of a certain amount of infighting and factions being formed with sort of hardliners on one side and sort of liberal reformers on the other. How do you see that playing out?
You're quite right. That has been very much the evidence that we've seen this year, where we have seen kind of initial proposed responses being very aggressive, being very hardline, but then subsequently either disappearing or not being pursued or greatly moderated. So it seems to me that yes, there is these kind of two battles that are taking place either side of the key decision maker, which of course is Mr. Putin. But there are definitely people who are very hawkish, who want a hardline response from the Kremlin or to the West. But then it seems as if Mr. Putin is also listening to reformers, people in the central bank, finance ministry, whatever, who point out the realities, as it were. If you do this, this will be the implications for the economy. This will be the implications for growth and presumably for the energy sector as well. And what we've seen all year, with one or two very, I wouldn't say minor exceptions, but with one or two exceptions, we've actually seen that trend, is that the subsequent kind of pragmatism has been much more kind of evident than, say, the initial proposed aggressive response. So again, as things stand right now, I don't see that changing. I do not see Russia putting any retaliatory actions against the West unless there is a significant ratcheting up of Western sanctions against Russia. But as it stands right now, I think that Russia's response is already done.
Yeah. And in terms of consolidation of the Russian oil industry, is there a chance that we can see more state control creeping in as these things develop?
Yes, I think that's fairly inevitable. And, first of all, it is kind of a basic policy of the Kremlin that the state should control the so-called strategic industries. The oil and gas is the most strategic. So it is absolutely without question that the Kremlin, the government, does accept that the state and will always control the energy sector. So, and I also believe that the hydrocarbon sector, oil and gas, is by far the most important industry for the country. A lot of money is going into the defence sector. There's a lot of talk about developing agriculture, etc. But it's all predicated on the oil and gas sector kind of more or less remaining stable. So if that's ever threatened, then I think we would see state resources shifting very quickly into that sector to repair it. So strong state support for the state companies in the sector. I think in any case there is this continuing creep of the oil company, of the state companies becoming larger. So I would now expect to see the state companies moving into the oil services industry to replace the foreign companies that are maybe now leaving. I would expect to see that there will be more kind of incremental or acquisitive growth by the state companies. And of course now we have the question mark over Bashneft because of the issue surrounding Sistema. And frankly, nobody in Moscow believes that the outcome of this is going to be anything other than Bashneft eventually being brought into Rosneft. So state getting bigger in the oil and gas sector, I think, has always been inevitable, and this current dispute and with sanctions make that even more so.
Sure. And finally, Chris, just one thing, the $64,000 question: will sanctions work? They're hardly likely to make President Putin just suddenly change his mind, are they?
Not at all. I think they've hardened his position. I think that, first of all, I don't see any reason or any evidence to suggest that President Putin will not remain in power for a second term right up to March 2024. So I think that's, if you like, if sanctions, if anything, have consolidated public support, Russian support around him, so it makes that even more likely rather than less. I think sanctions achieve two things, or three things. One is they absolutely ensure that the political divide we've seen between Russia and the West remains in place. So I think that's clear. If that was the objective, that's the job done. Secondly, there will be a short-term disruption in economic activity. There'll be certainly a tough economy in Russia this winter, 2015, in terms of ruble weakness, inflation, high interest rates. Again, that's largely a consequence of accumulated sanctions. But the third thing, a little bit further out, is that when Russia is ever faced with these sort of crises, it does tend to eventually get its act together. And there's been a lot of talk about import substitution, about creating domestically what Russia has been dependent on in terms of the Western imports. So we could certainly very well see in 5 years' time Russia having kind of a much more effective domestic industries, building rigs, supplying parts, expertise, etc. And we could look back at the sanctions period that happened. So sanctions will have an impact, but in different ways.
Chris Weafer, thank you very much.